Gilmour. I am actually a resident of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There are other Philadelphias. And I come from a background in food service. I've been a chef all my life. I got into food safety. A friend of mine calls me the accidental food safety expert because it's not something I intended to do. It wasn't my career path. However, I was working with farmers, helping them understand how to sell to the wholesale marketplace, and it became this really big wall to jump over. And in my value chain coordination career, it's always been about what's the latest, biggest barrier. And now, food safety is probably going to be for the rest of my life, fortunately. As Jan said, we were all involved in this USDA Group Gap pilot. I got a lot of training through that pilot, and now I am an independent consultant. I'm not with Extension, I'm not with the Department of Ag, I'm not with a big NGO. I just have my own little business, and I do a lot of different projects. So I work with the Pennsylvania Farmers Union, and I will say another plug for Farmers Union is they're going to work on the policies that you need to be able to do business. So it's really important that you support them. I also have a long-term project in the Chesapeake Bay or the Mid-Atlantic, and that is really focusing on getting more community-based food safety educators trained up. So I have a bunch of black and brown folks who are mostly in urban farming, but some of them in rural farming. And it's very important with food safety that farmers are going to feel comfortable with the person that's training them, and so it really helps if it's someone that looks like them. So that's something that we're really working on together. There's a whole cohort of us working on that. And then I do other things like this that come along, and they're really fun. So I'm going to be out in this area for 3 years, on and off, working with the Northwest Food Hub Network, hopefully working with people who are local, like Sarah, and then I've dragged in Phil. He's going to be talking about different ways of certifying with Group Gap. A lot of my time is spent working with farmers one-on-one to help them write that food safety plan, come up with do the risk assessments, etc. So it's really, I have found over the years, that is the way to actually get a farm implementing a food safety plan, is to work with them one-on-one. And I will be doing that with farmers in this large region. And so one of the things I want to find out is what is already available locally, because I'm in Philadelphia, so I'm not available on a moment-to-moment basis. So what I'm going to do is just go through a pretty high-level, not detailed, guided tour of the food safety landscape, food safety regulation and certification landscape. If I make mistakes, I never feel like I'm the most expert person in the room, so please feel free to jump in and say, hold on a minute, that doesn't sound right. We may argue, that's good, I don't mind. There's a lot of gray area in food safety, unfortunately, and food safety regulation. So that can happen, and Sarah, I absolutely encourage you, especially with the preventive control side of things, to jump in and say, I don't think that's right. Or just add context. All right, next slide. Oh, I went too far, that's why. Okay, so there's plenty of scary statistics on foodborne illness from contaminated food. Prepared foods containing undisclosed allergens are one of the biggest culprits there. Contaminated meat happens a lot, but you don't hear about it so much unless you're actually buying that meat. It's not something that seems to get into the media circus quite so much, but you get some peanut butter contaminated with salmonella or romaine lettuce that's killing people, and it becomes huge news. Next slide. So, why does produce safety seem to be such a big deal and implicated in so much foodborne illness these days? Part of it could be better reporting, maybe it was happening already, but it's not just that. So the really big reason is that we eat so much raw produce now, so much more than we used to. And it's not the fruits and vegetables themselves. I apologize if I'm saying stuff you already know, but I have learned that repetition is really good. Did you have a question, or you just? Oh. Oh, you're putting, okay. But yeah, I'm not going to do a food safety training today, but I'm just kind of hitting the high points. A lot of times in the food safety trainings, they give you a lot of statistical stuff. It's really more about we're eating food raw, much more. Pathogens in human and animal poop are equal opportunity offenders. They don't care whether you're organic, they don't care whether you're biodynamic, they don't care whether you're aeroponic. They're still around and they still can get into the food. Next slide. There are also new organisms in our environment, right, that are more virulent, much harder to avoid, especially from confined animal farming. So MRSA, E. coli, O1H757, the Aztec, sugar forming E. coli. Salmonella. Why is salmonella getting in our food? That's a chicken thing, right? But it is. So it's just much more prevalent, perhaps, than it used to be, or we're just aware of it. Next slide. And then, of course, we can't control everything in our environment. There are pathogens are finding their way onto farms via water, especially dust, truck beds and tires, human feet and hands, wildlife, domestic animals, inadequately cleaned packing lines. That's a really big one, people. I'll be talking to you a lot about that if I come to your farm packing and package shed. Next slide. And then the really big thing is in the past 50 years, produce supply chain has gotten much more complicated, much larger in scale, and the aggregation of vast amounts of raw produce commingled in large packing facilities leads to widespread cross-contamination. So, yes, generally the foodborne illness or foodborne contamination outbreaks tend to come from the big food aggregation world, but that doesn't mean it can't happen on a smaller farm. And if in your packing house you're commingling from multiple farms, you might have one farm that happens to have some sort of pathogen on leafy greens or melons or whatever it may be, and then it gets onto everybody's stuff. So it helps with a shorter supply chain. You're going to affect less people. Traceability is easier, but it can still happen. Next slide. So the great thing about bacteria and pathogens is you get in the right conditions and they're going to multiply like crazy. And I would say, what can you learn from this? Keeping things clean, tidy, cool, and dry as much as possible when possible. Really, really important. When I go onto a farm and it's really well organized and tidy, something inside of me just relaxes. I go, okay, these people either get it or they're going to get it. When I go onto a farm, and we've all seen some farms, the one with the 26 cats, all over the packing shed, or the one with the cardboard packing line, you just kind of go, oh, I don't even know if I can help this situation. So yeah, clean, tidy, cool, dry. Those are the things you want to think about. And then sources and carriers of contamination are all the things you find on any farm, right? Humans, animals, whether it's livestock or just wildlife, compost, and of course, water. And water is such a great carrier for pathogens, such a great vehicle. And then in addition, actually push the next animation. There we go. In addition to sources of the biological contamination from human pathogens, there are physical, chemical, and chemical contaminants like broken glass, rocks, metal fragments from machinery, from a packing line, fuels, lubricants. And then if on the farm or in the food hub you are storing meat, eggs, dairy, grains, or seafood, then you have allergens, and you have to think about how you're controlling for those allergens to make sure they're not getting onto anything and making people really hate getting sick from allergens, I've noticed. And then, so all of this to say that this real and perceived risk of foodborne illness from fruits and vegetables makes the food industry very, very, very nervous. And so in the past 30 years, this has led to a worldwide, not just the US, but a worldwide emergence of third-party audits for fruits, produce farms, and packing houses. And then, since 2011, when Obama signed into law the Food Safety Modernization Act, we now have 7 new food safety-related regulations that are all implemented, I think, at this point. All 7 of them, yeah. And FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, was really driven by consumer concern about foodborne illness. And there's a group called Safe Food Now. I always do that, because that's how it feels, Safe Food Now. That has really driven this policy. There are other, what are they called? Lobbying groups as well, but this is the one that tends to get the news. And these are folks that were concerned because they had family members who were getting sick, getting chronic illnesses, and also dying. So, they had good cause. Next slide. So, both the produce, I should say, of the FSMA regulations, the two that are most likely to impact food hubs and farms are the produce safety rule and the preventative controls for human food rule. Maybe the preventative controls for animal food may impact you, especially folks that are growing a lot of grain, or folks that are packing, storing, processing grain. But anyway, both the produce safety rule and produce safety audits, or GAP audits, are based on good agricultural practices, GAP or GAPs, and good agricultural practices focus on risk assessment and prevention. So a lot of the food safety standards that are out there really, fortunately, including the produce safety rule, are considered risk-based. So the farmer gets to do a risk assessment and decide where there are potential hazards, what they can do to reduce the risk of that kind of contamination happening, and where they need to put their limited time and resources. So some things are going to be high risk, medium risk, low risk, and you can figure out what do I need to address now. Through a process of continuous improvement, you're going to get to all of those things, but you don't have to do all of it at once. And it's kind of a double-edged sword, because sometimes you just want to be told what to do. You don't want to have to think. But the advantage of risk-based food safety standards is that you're not being told what you have to do. You're not being told that you have to tile your entire packing shed, which is going to potentially cost you a huge amount of money, or buy a brand new packing line, which is going to cost you huge amounts of money. You can do that kind of thing because actually it might make you more efficient and it's easier to clean, and usually infrastructure improvements will increase efficiency, but you don't have to do it unless you think it's necessary. And then it's all about also training people to recognize the conditions that lead to contamination, understanding how to reduce the risk of contamination. So what is GAP certification? So a certification body, or a CB, which is a third party, sends an auditor to audit your farm and your food safety plan at your farm or your food hub, and they're auditing it for compliance with a food safety standard. And if you pass the audit, then you receive certification. Then you have GAP or GAP-GIP or whatever certification it may be. And these are annual audits. At some point you're going to have to pay for them. A lot of them, if you're getting a USDA audit, there's cost sharing in a lot of places, a lot of states. Is there cost sharing in Washington? You don't know? Anybody know? Not in Montana, okay. There are only 14 states, I think. Okay, well, never mind. Sorry about that. Sometimes buyers, if they're really nice, will help to subsidize audits. Wegmans, I don't think you have Wegmans out here, but they've been very good about that kind of thing. And then the food safety standard itself is based on good agricultural practice, and it describes the required policies, procedures, and records that you need in your food safety program. And then certification, oh, well, I'll get to that. So for produce farmers, again, the produce safety rule, and for some hubs, the produce safety rule, we're going to get into when a hub is covered by this. So if you gross now more than an average of more than 28,500 over 3 years, it's adjusted for inflation just to confuse you. And if any of the produce is usually eaten raw, and if you sell more than 50% to an intermediary like a distributor, a food hub, a retail distribution center would be not going direct to the store but to their warehouse, then it's likely you'll have to comply with the produce safety rule. And this is the law, If you're covered, you must comply, as opposed to GAP certification, which is a business decision. You do that if you want to sell to buyers that require it. How much time do I have?
9:47. We got
Oh, okay, cool. Because I do tend to go on. What's that? An hour. Cool. Thank you. Because I wanted time for discussion, and I do tend to go on a bit. So then, for food hubs, it can be more complicated, and we'll talk a bit about that. The regulation that applies to food hubs could be the produce safety rule. It could be the preventive controls rule for human food, depending on the hub ownership and activities. It could fall under this more complicated preventive controls rule, and then a buyer might require something that even goes beyond that. So, and now I can't read my oh, there we go. So, do farms have to be GAP certified or comply with FSMA to sell to wholesale buyers? So that depends on who you're selling to. Usually restaurants, local stores, caterers, smaller co-ops do not have any food safety requirements for their produce farms. Some institutions, self-operated, meaning they do their own cooking, they don't bring in a contracted food service provider. They may or may not require certification. Sort of depends on how food safety literate they are. Distributors and food service contractors. Does everyone know what I mean by a food service contractor? I'll just tell you. Tell me. You tell us.
What's that?
What's a food service contractor?
Me. I'm a food service.
You're a food service. Who are you with?
Bon appetit.
Oh yeah. Okay. Cool. So what does Bon Appetit do to call itself a food service contractor?
We provide food service for corporations, colleges.
So you provide food service for corporations, colleges. You don't do hospitals, right?
Yeah. What's that?
Do you do any hospital food service? Any school, any K through 12?
Colleges.
Just, okay.
All right.
Right. And Bon Appetit is one of the friendly ones. And has been for a while. Even when they got bought by Compass, they still remain friendly. Okay. That was a while ago. Okay. I do always say the wrong thing. Just expect that. So, and then large retail chains and restaurant chains almost always want to have their produce vendors GAP certified. And the USDA and State Department of Ag, I think you're hearing from someone from the state today, they may or may not require it. And you really want to check into that. If you're doing some sort of emergency food program or school program or whatever, you really got to check to see whether GAP certification is part of that. And then, so the produce safety rule compliance, again, depends on the business size and scope. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what your buyers require. Although with USDA and state programs, they might require it. So then, does a hub have to be audited or FSMA compliant to sell to wholesale buyers? So again, it depends. Usually, again, restaurants and smaller grocery stores, etc., don't require it. Or pretty much always larger retail chains and restaurant chains do. Some institutions, again, don't require GAP certification. Some do if you sell to them directly. So meaning you're not going through a distributor, you're not going through a food service contractor, you're selling direct to the university or the hospital. They're getting more concerned about food safety, I would say. So they may require it. They might not know what they're requiring, but they may require it. And again, distributors and food service contractors often require GAP certification. Also may need you to become an approved supplier before you can even talk to them about selling. And Bon Appetit has their own program. Others may want you to have a much more rigorous food safety program at your food hub. So again, compliance with the FSMA rules depends on your business size and scope. So just repeating, the customer's demands trump all of that. Even if you are completely exempt from any of the regulation, if the buyer wants you to be GAP certified or preventive controls is different. Have some kind of third-party audit, then you do that. if you see a return on investment. And for farms, generally GAP certification is going to satisfy the produce safety rule. The one thing that's not specified in GAP certification is taking the PSA grower training, which at this time is the only approved FDA training that qualifies the supervisory people, there we go, the supervisors on the farm, qualifies the farm to be covered by the produce safety rule. Somebody in the farm in a supervisory position has to take that training. And it's great to have more than one person trained, as Sarah said, especially because people come and go. And I think even at the farm level, they don't actually have to work for the farm, but they have to have a supervisory role. Next slide. So requirements for the produce safety rule, as I said, manager attends the FDA approved training, manager trains the workers at least annually. They're getting a lot more into what does it mean to train workers, not just having them read through some health and hygiene policies and sign a log. There's a lot more to it now. So I think the PSA grower trainings probably are going into more detail than they used to on worker training. There are some required records for the produce safety rule, just not a lot. Again, it depends on what you're doing on the farm. I just put a little selection of them there for you. And then the farm is inspected possibly annually. It really depends on the capacity of the inspectors, either at the state or FDA level. I know in Pennsylvania there are so many farms that have to be produce safety inspected that they're not expecting to go to the smaller farms every year. They probably will go to the bigger farms every year, but they're just overwhelmed by the number of farms. And then really the requirements under the produce safety rule in the industry are considered minimum requirements for a produce farm. And it's not that difficult. Farmers might be really resistant to it, but that's the lowest bar, and we want to get them there. Next slide. So requirements for GAP certification, so in addition to the training, in addition to the records, you've got a written food safety plan that includes procedures for traceability and recall. That's not part of the produce safety rule yet. There are more records. There's a series of risk assessments if you're doing harmonized GAP. The rigor and complexity of your food safety program will depend on the standard you have to comply with, and also the size and complexity of your operation. Next slide. So, if a customer requires food safety certification, what are you going to do? You're going to ask questions to begin with. Is there a specific standard or audit program that they want you to audit to? And this applies at the hub level as well as the farm level. Do they have a preferred certification body? So are they going to be okay with the USDA? Are they going to be okay with Phil's program? Are they going to be okay with Quality Fresh, which is a very small company that does mostly audits of Amish farms all around the country? You've got to find these things out. Do they require you to upload documentation to some kind of blockchain or supply chain management program? That can be a real barrier for farmers and food homes. And then if your customer isn't specific, you get to decide, which is nice. Sometimes they think they know what they're doing, and then you want to call on people like us to help advocate. Sometimes they're just being pushed by their legal department to do so. And then the other question is, who do you want to pay? Because you will be paying for these audits. So which standards should I certify to? There's a lot of food safety standards out there, lots of audit programs or audit schemes as they're called in other parts of the world, but America doesn't like a good scheme. So there's state, there's federal, there's international, there's for-profit and non-profit. A lot of the requirements are similar, but some programs are more detailed, more demanding, possibly more rigorous. Sometimes they're just more detailed and annoying. So again, seek help, ask experienced food hubs, ask experienced farmers. Don't try and go it alone. And then which auditor should I use? Again, there's lots of auditors and certification bodies to choose from. I like to call it the food safety industrial complex. I didn't add in the slide where I just put in all these millions of different logos. because it's scary. But anyway, you're going to, in this area, I think you have people who are going to help you figure this stuff out. So prices vary considerably for auditing. The USDA is probably, well, Quality Fresh is the cheapest. I think possibly anywhere in the whole country is the cheapest. And their auditors don't get paid very well. I know that. So, but anyway, it's a good program. The USDA is probably the next, well, Group Gap maybe the next. Anyway, we're not going to talk about numbers too much today. But anyway, just know that there's a lot of variety in cost. And if you go with a Primus GFS audit or an NSF audit, they might be auditing to Canada Gap or Primus or one of the others, or a global gap audit, you're getting into the thousands of dollars. And you only want to do that if it's worth the return on investment. And then some auditors, like the USDA, actually own their own programs and audit their own programs. The other certifying bodies on here are all licensed to audit other people's food safety programs. I'm getting very food safety nerdy here, so I'm going to move on. Does anyone know what the Global Food Safety Initiative is? You may hear this from larger buyers, that they want you to be GFSI audited. That's actually inaccurate. The GFSI, or the Global Food Safety Initiative, is an organization that has established an international standard for food safety program benchmarking. So they want to see different kinds of food safety programs having equivalency across the programs. They don't own a food safety program, they don't audit a food safety program, they don't certify anybody. They're just an industry partnership that provides that kind of assurance to the industry, and it's international. So they want these different programs to meet baseline criteria, basically. So if your buyer requires you to be GFSI certified, it means they want you to be certified by one of the several audit programs that are GFSI benchmarked. USDA is literally, they don't use the term benchmarked, it's government equivalent. You don't have to worry about that. Again, I'm getting nerdy. So Primus, GFS, Global Gap, Canada Gap, and the USDA all have programs that are GFSI benchmarked. They have multiple programs in some cases, so you've got to make sure you pick the one that is GFSI benchmarked. Yeah. So, timeline for gap certification. It depends. It's just whenever you talk to a food safety educator, the first thing they will answer to a question is, it depends. So what does your customer require? What's your complexity and scale? What are your training needs? What's your food safety literacy at the farm or food hub? How much capacity do you have? Right, that's the biggest one. Not even money, it's just brain, space, and time. And then are you going to use consultants? Are you going to reach out to free resources, that kind of thing, which highly, highly recommend. Fortunately, I am mostly grant funded, so I love that I get to work with lots of farmers and I never have to charge them a penny. And then I say, realistically, if you want to get a farm or a small food hub ready, audit ready, at least 9 months, because if you do it too quickly, it doesn't stick, people get really frustrated, they run screaming. Usually the person that helped you do it at the facility or at the farm leaves because they're frustrated. Often that happens. And then you don't have a food safety program anymore. So you want to make sure, I like a 2-year process myself. That's ideal, because then you can really do things and phase it in and not try and get it all done too quickly. And then what will it cost? It depends, right? The biggest challenge is, as I said, capacity and time. It's more aggravating than difficult, and it often requires an attitude shift. I say this almost every day when I'm talking about food safety, that I take farmers through the 5 stages of grief, and then we can actually write a food safety plan. It's usually not as scary or overwhelming as you expect, or they expect. It's usually true that at the farm level, you don't need expensive improvements to comply with the standards, although all those things that you've been wanting to do to your farm, now is the time, if you have the money or the capacity. And then it may be different for a food hub warehouse. You may actually need to spend some capital to get things up to grade. And then one of the great benefits with creating a food safety plan, a food safety program, is it is a kind of quality control, and you start to analyze your operations and your systems. So you start to get a better picture of where things are working well and where they're not. So I always, when I'm working with farmers, when I talk about pathogens, I say, think about all the things you do to prevent plant pathogens from causing a crop failure. This is the same thing. This is the same kind of thinking. And you do that because you think it's a great idea. You don't want to make people sick. You don't want your plants to get sick. Same bucket. Systemic change is easiest step by step. As I said, give it some time, continuous improvement, not immediate perfection. Add a new element or two each year. Even when you get GAP certified, there's still improvement, and they want to see continuous improvement. The auditors want to see that. And then everyone needs to be engaged. The worst thing you can see is when you go to a farm and they've hired someone to be the food safety officer and nobody is paying any attention. The boss thinks it's ridiculous and they are just set up to fail. So everybody needs to understand how important it is. And you need someone who's in a supervisory position. And you should delegate. You shouldn't try and do it all yourself. The more people who are engaged in record keeping and monitoring, the more they're going to care about your program. So do it as a team. And then if complexity or customer requirements make it very costly or time intensive, again, is it worth the return on investment? Is this the right market for you if a buyer is requiring this? And then what does it cost? Again, someone has to do the work of writing and managing the food safety manual. You might, I've been to farms where they've just had a consultant write them a food safety plan. They come up with a binder like this for a potato and cabbage farm, and they put it on a shelf and they never look at it again. And I had the greatest fun going through this folder once and just going, you don't need this, you don't need this, you don't need this, and we came down to like 20 pages. They were really happy, and they didn't have to pay me. They probably paid that consultant $3,000. So keeping it simple, but getting some help is really important. But you can't outsource the implementation and management of that program, right? You need to have everybody on board and somebody supervising and overseeing. And then for a small to mid-size operation, it could cost anywhere from, I don't think anything costs $300 anymore. Well, actually, yeah, Quality Fresh charges co-ops, maybe around $350, $400 to thousands of dollars. The advantage of using a consultant, the cost of having a manual developed, I thought I got rid of that. I don't know how much it costs to pay someone to develop your manual, because I do it for free all the time. So, but it can cost you thousands. Consultants can cost like $350 an hour, so it gets pretty pricey. But the advantage of using someone like me or Sarah or others who've developed templates is we have all that stuff, we know how to customize them, and we can walk you through the process. I do not write plans for farmers, I write plans with farmers. Because it's not my plan, and they know their business best. And it's also good to get other people besides the person responsible for food safety involved. So if you're writing a standard operating procedure, you make sure that the people who are actually implementing that procedure get to vet it and tell you, well, that 3-page SOP, that's not going to work. So let's simplify. The cost of the third-party audit may vary. Okay, that's where I was talking about the $550 to $3,000. Okay, I'm getting confused by my own notes. And then, yeah, we talked about the cost sharing. That's probably not happening around here. Damn it. So, food safety at the hub level. For hubs that are just holding and distributing cases and packages of food, if you just, well, we're going to, I'm going to skip this and we'll get into more of this. But I just will say, yeah, no, we'll get to that when we do. Phil and I go over that. All right. So, Okay, so the whole where do I begin? Take it seriously, get some training, get your farmers trained, start there. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to go over to the flip chart. Okay, so is your hub covered by the produce safety rule? Does anybody know if their hub is covered by the produce safety rule? Ooh, beginner's mind. Okay, so these are the questions you want to ask. Is it more than 50% farmer owned? Is more than 50% of the food sold from the farmer owners? So even if it's owned by farmers, more than 50% owned by farmers, it's a co-op, but you're selling a whole lot of other people's products and it's more than 50%, you get into the grey area. Are you growing and holding crops frequently eaten raw? So if all you're doing is potatoes and sweet potatoes, you're not covered by the regulation. However, your buyer may still require you to be GAP certified. I've worked with potato farmers who are selling to processors, and they still have to be GAP certified. It's a little silly. What is Steve call it? Food safety theatre. Are your average annual produce sales more than, it's actually 28,500 on average over 3 years. It's again adjusted for inflation. And then is less than 50% of the food sold to a qualified end user. So a qualified end user would be a restaurant, a caterer, CSA, farmer's market, even direct to a store, direct to a hospital. You're not going through a middle person. So these are the questions. Anyone else want to add anything to that?
That's less than?
I'm sorry, I put more, but I meant less. So less than 50% of food is sold to a qualified end user. So if more than 50% is going through the intermediary, then you will have to comply with produce safety. So I just got a little confused with this sentence.
Can you qualify if it's an and or if it's all an and?
Good question, Jan. So I think, so if I was talking about a produce farm, it would be more of an and or. But for a hub, which is a warehouse, we're holding, distributing, maybe doing some repacking, then all of these things need to be true for you to be covered by the produce safety. Right? So if all of this is true and you sell less than 500,000 adjusted for inflation on average over 3 years of food, all food, you may be qualified exempt. But we didn't really want to get into that today. We could, if someone wants to talk about qualified exemption and exclusion, we can do that. But honestly, complying with the produce safety rule should be bottom line for everybody. So if these are true, then you're covered by the produce safety rule. And as long as you're not processing, you're covered by the produce safety rule. Does that sound right, Sarah? So many conversations with colleagues about, is that right? Try and get it stuck in the brain. Now, what conditions kick you up to the next level of compliance? The hub is not owned by farmers. So if you're an independent business, even if you're just holding and distributing produce, you may not have to comply with preventive controls, but you have to do more than just the produce safety rule. If more than 50% of food sales comes from non-owner farms, so even if it's owned by farms, so that other question's around the other way, if more than 50% of food sales comes from non-owner farms, the produce safety rule will not be sufficient. If you do more than 1 million average annual sales of all food and you're processing, or if any of these are true, you may have to comply with preventive controls. most things are going to kick you out of the produce safety rule. You probably have to comply with good manufacturing practices, GMPs, and food defense. The USDA is coming along with 2 new audit scopes, they're called, for basically food hubs, really, and farmers who are aggregating product. And you may be able to get away right now, or you can get away with doing the simplest USDA audit, which is it's good handling practices. They call it GAP, but it's the GIP part, the good handling practices that you're being audited to. Yeah.
I've got a question in the chat. I don't know if you can take it now.
Sure.
Are the food safety
Will,
rules,
can you take the last one?
are the food safety rules different if your farmer owner co-op only sells direct to consumer?
Yes, if you're owned by the farmers, you're selling direct to consumer, and your total food sales are less than 500,000 on average over 3 years, then you can be qualified exempt. No. Yeah. Yeah. However, quite often it's above $1 million, and then you do have to comply with produce safety. Because the point of having a aggregation point is to increase sales, and then the joys of scaling up people is there are more things you have to worry about. If you are processing food at your food hub, then you're likely to have to comply with the preventive controls rule, and there are going to be state and county regulations as well. So your local health department may be coming out, the state may be inspecting, probably you will. Actually, this is if you're doing over $1 million in sales, you have to register as a facility with the FDA. So when you're thinking about processing, and a lot of people are, just keep in mind that there's many food safety and regulatory complexities that come along with that. So doing it on a small scale is not necessarily cost effective. And then bottom line, what does your buyer require? Again, if you want to be an approved supplier for Bon Appetit or for Sodexo or for Aramark or smaller regional food service providers or a distributor, they may require your food hub to have a pretty sophisticated food safety program. SQF, NSF, there's a bunch of different ones, lots of acronyms. So SQF is the one I'm seeing the larger food hubs do, and it is complex. So just looking at this slide, the kinds of things that you can get into for food hub processing food is, as I said, registering as a facility. You've got the preventive controls for human food regulation, which requires, as Sarah said, someone either on staff or contracted to come and monitor the program. That is a preventive controls qualified individual. You need your good manufacturing practices. You're going to have to do a hazard analysis, which is, I like to say, a risk assessment of risky processes. And then preventive controls, which is hazard control plans for all those risky processes. If anybody has done HACCP, it's based on HACCP principles. And then you'll have a written plan, and you'll have lots of standard operating procedures, and you'll have many records. So it's not something to enter into lightly. You have annual inspections. If you're registered with the FDA, they're going to be showing up whenever they feel like it. So you've got to be ready for unannounced. And it might be the state, it might be feds. And then, as I said, state and county regulations apply. I wanted to just back up a little. Okay, so the food hubs who are just holding and distributing whole cases and packages of food, if you're not considered what's called a secondary farm, which is when you're owned by the farmers or a farmer, there'll be the good handling practices, the good manufacturing practices, and what's included under those good manufacturing practices is food safety training, sanitation procedures, allergen control, really important if you're handling animal foods and flour, wheat, and so on. Seafood, those are eggs, cheese. And then you're going to have a supplier verification program, which can also come along with GAP certification. I'm not going to go into that really. And then food defense is a big deal now. Doesn't have to be that complicated, but you want to make sure that you are paying attention to uninvited people coming into your operation. And then, of course, traceability and recall, and you're going to get annually audited. I'm going to stop there. Any questions? Any additions? Yes. Can you take your mask off?
Does the preventative control certification expire?
Ooh. Well, that's a good question. Does it expire? Well, you're going to get inspected annually, so you might fail. Oh, sorry. Does a preventive controls certification, can it expire?
Like for the person who's certified?
For the food hub or whoever, the processor that's certified. No, it doesn't expire, but you can fail it if you're not keeping it up. Because it'll expire if you decide not to do it anymore.
I mean, like, I did a 3-day training, like, 4 years
Oh, you mean
ago.
the training, the certification of the qualified individual? No, that's a once and done, which is sort of silly, honestly. It's so much information. I've done it. Do I remember a lot of that stuff? No, I've been reading up on it lately because I'm going to be dealing with food hubs. There it is. Oh, beautiful.
HACCP is the same way.
HACCP is the same. Well, and also
Certified in HACCP, you
the-
be very certified.
right, and I have the HACCP training too, but do I do HACCP plans? No? Yeah, it's so heavy. I have so many, and I have like multiple iterations. The PSA grower training is also a once and done. You don't have to keep doing that. But that may change. I have a feeling there might be some kind of refresher things. We'll see. Any other questions?
What's
Thoughts?
the time at the end?
Yeah. So I'm going to hand it off to Phil to talk about different certifications and group debt. Okay.
Thanks, Linz.
Sure.